Hello and welcome to the latest of Catholic Concern for Animals conversations. And today we have our second academic after Dr. Lynn Snedden in Josh Milburn from the University of Sheffield, who is a philosopher in a politics department and has written a lot and discussed a lot and talked a lot about animal rights and animal advocacy. Welcome, Josh. And
thanks, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. I mean, just to mention that if any of you want to have a look at Josh's work, he has a website on which a number of his publications are available. He's also the current leader of the podcast Knowing Animals. There is also some media on his website as well, so I'd recommend going and having a look at it, seeing what he has to say. So, Josh, you describe in the stuff that I've read and seen of your work, you describe yourself as coming from a liberal perspective in all this, and kind of definitely concerned about the application of reason to the issue of animal advocacy. How does that kind of figure in terms of where you see the debates on animal advocacy going, and particularly kind of in relation to people from faith backgrounds and people with other views of morality and ethics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing to say, I suppose, is to acknowledge that my work doesn't really come from a religious perspective, and I don't see myself as a religious person. But one of the great things about liberalism, or one of the historical and kind of theoretical features of liberalism, has been about its inclusion of different religious views and different ethical views. So what I think is important, and I say this as someone who started out in a big way in moral philosophy, thinking about individual obligations to each other and to animals, but moved into political philosophy, so thinking about the place of animals in the state. What I think is really important to distinguish are those kinds of things that the state should be enforcing, the kinds of protections that should be given to animals and protected by the coercive power of the state, from those matters that are kind of merely moral matters, right? So the idea in a sentence of a liberal political theory is that this is something that people from all kinds of different religious and moral backgrounds can get behind, while there's still lots of room for the moral and religious disagreement. So to use a straightforward example, the liberal state does not enforce a particular religious view upon its citizens. Instead, it supports religious freedom and allows space for all religions to flourish, as long as those religions are being practiced in a respectful way. Now, of course, the quirk of my work, as it were, the significance of my work when it comes to liberal theory, is that I say that respectful way includes respect for not just other people, but animals as well.
I mean, in Catholic Concern for Animals, we make a point of saying that it's the whole of creation, the whole of animal life that we're concerned with. Would you view that as being the same from your perspective? I mean, is there a distinction to be made amongst some animals rather than others?
Yeah, that's another very good question. So two things to say, I suppose. The first thing is that I identify as a sentientist. Now that's a word that's used in a few different ways, but as I'm using the word here, it means basically the basis of concern is sentience. So I allow, for example, and I should define sentience. Sentience, I mean roughly something like the capacity to feel pain, subjective experience. There is something that it is like to be that being. So I think that all sentient animals are warranting of moral consideration and indeed of rights, but I allow that there might be lots of animals who are not sentient, or maybe I should say that are not sentient. An example I sometimes use is oysters or jellyfish. I'm not convinced that they're the kind of things that have rights. However, there are lots of animals who are sentient, and certainly many of the animals we typically imagine when we're talking about animal rights fall into that category. The second quick thing to say is that that's the kind of baseline, but above that baseline, there's going to be variation between different animals. And I use the language of interests. So I would say, what interests does this particular animal have? And some animals might have different interests. Let me give a really straightforward example. Some animals have interest in access to salt water, others don't, right? However, some may have stronger or weaker interests. So animals with particular cognitive capacities might have a much stronger interest in staying alive. Now, that doesn't mean it's okay to go and start killing other animals, but it might mean that the animals warrant different levels of consideration in decision making when it comes to their deaths.
Would you see that kind of clash of interests as being like the kind of clash of rights that different people may have, or is there kind of like something qualitatively different about that?
Yeah, I think it's roughly the same thing. I think when we have an expansive system of rights, as we currently do with the human rights ideas, we're going to see conflicts between those rights potentially. And when we expand that domain of rights, as we do when we start talking about animal rights, we're potentially going to expand the range of conflicts between rights. And that raises some difficult questions, right? And these are in many ways the bread and butter of philosophical conversations about rights. It's what kinds of rights do different beings possess, and how do we deal with conflicts between those rights? So let me give an example. Something that I'm working on at the moment, something which is a big concern of mine, are potential conflicts of rights between humans who need access to food and the animals who would be harmed in the pursuit of that food. Now, let me be clear that I'm certainly not the kind of person who's going to say, oh, well, some animals, need to die so that we can eat them. I think we should be vegans. I'm a vegan. And I think that respect for animal rights means veganism or something close to it. But it's that something close to it that really makes all the difference. And the clash of rights, the clash of potential rights between animals and humans can be a way into exploring that.
Given the kind of liberal background and liberal patina to the work that you've put forward, does that? I mean, how does that fit? I mean, currently we have a world which is dominated by liberal democracies. I mean, I would suggest that some of the actions of our government recently have almost been libertarian in terms of their attitude and approach to things. And how does that kind of like fit with kind of different approaches in terms of Buddhist views or the views of communist China or Russia with respect to this? I mean, are we just kind of like taking our Western views and imposing them on the globe?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that liberalism does have a particular history, of course, and liberalism has emerged in a particular location, right? And so I agree that there's a problem potentially with imposing it too quickly on other environments. And I should say that I remain open to the possibility. Let me echo John Rawls here, the great liberal philosopher. I remain open to the possibility that there are non-liberal ways of ordering our societies that are respectful to humans and indeed respectful to animals, right? And let's be quite clear that actually existing liberal societies are not often very friendly towards animals. But then, of course, neither are actually existing other kinds of societies, socialist societies, for example. The Soviet Union was not a utopia for animals. And so we need to be careful about just exporting liberalism. But I think there might still be room for, first of all, acknowledging the advantages of liberalism when it comes to a human rights or an animal rights agenda. But also, I think that there's room for exploring these things in what we might call, well, a pragmatic or a non-ideal approach. Just say, well, look, this is the kind of world in which we find ourselves. What sort of resources, what kinds of ideas are there within liberal theory for protecting animals? So I am not someone who would necessarily be leading the charge, as it were, to push liberalism upon non-liberal societies, even while I do think that there might be very important advantages for both humans and animals in liberal societies relative to many non-liberal ways of ordering our society.
I'm going to ask the same question with a slightly different perspective now, because the other thing that's always struck me about rights approaches is that rights, moral concepts are fundamentally human. They are about us, they are about our perspectives, our intellectual media. To what extent, I mean, are we just taking these concepts and imposing them on the rest of creation? Are we imposing essentially human ideas, human constructs on the rest of the animal kingdom?
Yeah, great question. I think that, well, there's a number of different ways I could answer this. I think that in some ways it doesn't matter so much, or at least it doesn't matter for my work. What I'm often interested in doing is finding ways or taking existing ideas and taking existing notions and seeing if we can include animals within them, right? And the idea of rights and the idea of liberalism might just be kind of a few examples of that. But let me expand that beyond my work a little bit. Now, there are ways of conceiving of rights as not merely human constructs, right, but as something that actually exists out there in the world. And when I first met Chris, I remember we were at a conference in Amsterdam, I think it was, and Chris, you asked about whether we could talk about rights without the foundation of theology, right? Whether without God or the objectivity provided by a religious understanding, we could make sense of rights. Now, I think that that's one way of grounding the objectivity of morality, and I would stress justice as well. But I think there are other ways as well. We don't have to be theologians, or we don't have to be religious to recognise that something like an objective morality might exist. And so I don't think we should be too quick to think that these are mere human constructs. But then there's another sense that even if they are, so what, right? Even if they are, if this is a way to protect animals, if this is a way to stop the awful things that we do to animals, to aid them in the challenges that they face, it doesn't really matter whether or not these are human constructs. I don't think, for example, the cow in the slaughterhouse really minds the nature of the construct that stops her being slaughtered. She just doesn't want to be slaughtered. She doesn't want to experience suffering. She doesn't want to have a calf taken from her. And so there's a sense in which it almost doesn't matter whether these are human constructs, whether this is an objective morality or what, if our concern is with helping animals.
But many people who, I mean, you know, if you take, for example, anglers, one of their frequent arguments is that we only believe that these animals suffer the kind of problems that we suffer, that they suffer dislocation, they suffer pain, they suffer distress. We cannot know it. I mean, you know, you said before that the measure of sentience is feeling pain. It's subjective. How can you know what any other person is experiencing, let alone what other animals are experiencing?
Yeah, very good. So I think that you're absolutely right to tie this to the possibility of kind of radical skepticism about other humans having minds. We have access to our own minds. We have access to our own subjective experiences, but we don't have access to the subjective experiences of any others. And that includes any other humans. However, I think that this is mostly, but not entirely, mostly a scientific question. And there's been a range of methods developed in various branches of science to attempt to find those other beings that can experience pain. Now, we take it for granted, and I think rightly so, that other humans, for the most part, can feel pain. Of course, there's always going to be counterexamples, curious exceptions. And it's very easy to see that other animals that behave in similar ways, are biologically constituted in similar ways to humans, also experience pain, right? So exactly the same kinds of arguments we can use with regards to other humans, we can apply to many other animals. Now, things get more complicated the further away from humans you get in terms of biology, in terms of behavior, and so on and so forth. So I spent a bit of time, for example, reading the various studies that have been done into invertebrates, shrimp, crabs, lobster, and even insects, right? There are people doing this kind of work. And what's emerged is not a kind of test where you run the test and you say, right, there is pain, right, there isn't pain, in the same way that we might test, I don't know, for the presence of oxygen, right? We have these very objective measures, but what we do have are a list of potential criteria. And the more criteria an animal ticks off, the more likely it is, according to our best estimates, that these beings feel pain. So we can have relatively high certainty levels with some animals. So I would include easily all other vertebrates in that category, including fish. And we can have some degree of certainty with many other invertebrates. Octopuses and cephalopods are a good example of this. And then it gets more and more complicated, right? So when it comes to something like insects, I just don't know. I suspect, based on my reading of the literature, that they're probably not sentient. However, I think that there's a good enough chance that we need to ask these questions seriously. And then if you go down another level, as it were, to, again, let me mention jellyfish, oysters, I don't think these animals are sentient. Now, and I think that's really important because my particular interest, or one of my particular interests, is in food systems. Now, as it happens, both oysters and jellyfish are eaten. I've never eaten either of them, but I know many people do eat them. In the Far East, jellyfish are eaten. Oysters, of course, popular food in much of Western Europe. And so that could be really important.
I've forgotten the next question I was going to ask. I was listening to you so intently. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about the kind of things which divide us in terms of approach. I mean, in terms of, you know, kind of attitudes to the nature of morality and so on. What you have said in other work is that what's important is that we work together in terms of our common goals. So what kind of obstacles and opportunities do you think are there in terms of, you know, kind of you working with people like us in terms of promoting those common goals and the common benefits that we want to achieve?
Great question. I think it's often important to meet people where they are, right? So despite how we've started this conversation, I don't necessarily think that a great first step for me talking to you is trying to convince you that there is no God, right? That's not going to be a useful exercise, even if, as it happens, I don't believe in God, or even if, as it happens, I don't think that morality is grounded in God. I think it's really nice to meet people where they are, spiritually, religiously, morally, politically. So let me use political as an example. Although I am myself a liberal, I've done a good bit of work exploring where animal rights might fit in a libertarian picture. Why is that important? Well, lots of people are libertarian, right? And so when I meet these people, as I do, I can talk to them about how animal rights fits in their picture, fits in their political understanding. And of course, when we start to meet people where they are, when we start to engage seriously with people who might have views very different to our own, we start to find resources that we can draw from, okay? We start to find ideas that are beneficial. So libertarian ideas of property, I found very useful as a way to think about our relationship with wild animals and the duties we might have to leave them alone or to help them when we've when we've threatened them in important kinds of ways. And those are not necessarily ideas that I would have come across were I not engaging closely with libertarian thought. And of course, the same sort of thing can be said with regard to religious ideas. You know, there are important traditions, animal-friendly traditions, in many of the world's religions. You mentioned Buddhism before. Of course, there's a lot of animal-friendly work in Buddhism. Same, of course, in Catholicism, Judaism, various strands of Hinduism. And I think that these ideas can be very influential on people who maybe don't share the religious ideas, or can help people who do share those religious ideas to move towards more animal-friendly ways of life or modes of thought. So I think that I see the goals of, say, sentientism, which again I'm here defining as simply concern for all sentient animals. I see that as a goal that we can reach from many different places, whether that is your concern of for all creation in kind of Catholic language, or whether that's the kind of relatively dry rights language that I would use with regards to interests and so forth. And I think that that's a good thing. To again use the language of liberalism, that gives us the potential for an overlapping consensus. It doesn't necessarily matter why we believe that these things matter. The fact that we recognize them as mattering is enough for us to work together towards this common goal. And again, that's what matters if it's helping animals that matter. Resolving our deep religious disagreements or our deep ethical disagreements might not actually matter if we can come to similar kinds of conclusions about the status of animals.
Chris, is there anything that you want to add at this stage?
Yeah, and it is already as I expected it to be, a very interesting discussion. And I think one of the things that I'll just throw in at this point is the issue of sentience. Because I think today, while we're talking, the House of Lords yet again is looking at the animal sentience bill, and some of the creatures you were talking about, Josh. I know that Crustacean Compassion are out there today, calling for some of the creatures that they particularly care about that are not included in the proposed legislation, for example. So it's a very interesting debate about what is and what is not going to go into that particular piece of legislation, and regarding sentience. So I thought it was just worth mentioning that, as it's actually happening today, I believe, while we're speaking. And I know that organisation are at Westminster with their supporters, actually trying to make sure their point of view about what should be included is listened to by parliamentarians as they're making their decisions and making their points. One of the more general thing is that I'm sure you've heard me say this before somewhere or other, possibly even in Amsterdam when we were there in 2016, which was about rights, whichever political system we tend to live in, and they vary, as we've already discussed, from place to place across the globe. If I live here, I've got one set of rights given to me. If I lived perhaps in another place, I might have a different set. But what we say is obviously that all these rights come from God. So therefore, the animal rights come from God also, not from what we as humans wish to give to ourselves or to other creatures. So that's an interesting difference from our perspective. But it's already very interesting. We're talking about sentience, and we've got this existing legislation going through today, again being discussed, and we have this all very, very, in fact, I would argue, quite a complicated discussion argument about what is rights generally and how they are in the non-human creation. I mean, as I said, not an academic, so I always put that clause in there. I'm not an academic, but there's massive debate about what is a human right, isn't there? Yet alone what rights extend to non-humans.
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting that you bring in that distinction between what we might call natural rights and the rights of citizenship, because I think the same sort of thing, the same sort of conversation is taking place when it comes to animal rights. So traditionally, and whether this is in moral philosophy, and of course there is a good tradition of animal rights in theology as well, theological ethics, traditionally, the focus has been on what we might call natural rights, so rights that animals have in virtue of their capacities. So, for example, in virtue of their sentience. But I'm also really interested, and I think this is one of the great contributions of this emergence of animal rights being done by political philosophers. And like I say, I moved myself very much from moral philosophy to political philosophy, is to talk about the kinds of rights that animals might have as community members, or if you like, as citizens. So whether they can be included in political decision making, for example, whether they can be included in welfare provisions, right, and other kinds of legal, political, social rights that we might want to distinguish from the relatively straightforward rights, say, not to be killed, not to be made to suffer. So if you think about this in the human case, we've got the International Declaration of Human Rights. All humans get those, in theory, if not in practice. But then individual states will also have further rights. So I, as a British citizen, have certain rights to access certain kinds of resources, for example. But I don't have that, or I didn't have that when I lived in Canada because I wasn't a Canadian citizen, right? And similar kinds of things are going on, or are potentially going on, in the animal case. And I think that some of the most interesting work in this area is taking rights that human citizens have and saying, well, could we include animals in that? Could we make sense of that with regard to animals? And that leads to some quite surprising sounding conclusions. But I think that it's one of the ways that academia is potentially paving the way for some interesting future activism.
If I could quickly come back, I mean, again, and I won't be too long because I want Gerald to ask you some more questions. But it's the issue of rights is quite fascinating, just, you know, for us as UK citizens. Because a couple of years ago, probably even less, I had the right to work and live in the European Union. I haven't got that anymore, through no fault of my own, I have to say, which is, you know, a fundamental change in my, or could be, for my future. I might have wanted to go and live elsewhere and retire elsewhere. That has now been probably denied to me because of just a change of our relationship with the European Union recently. That's just an interesting thing about rights that you take for granted suddenly can be there no longer. And that's a particularly a contemporary example for us. I mean, one of the things that I remember from that that Amsterdam conference was I think, and you were involved in not only presenting but organising, so you'll probably have a better memory bit than mine if I get this wrong. But there was a discussion regarding the work of Professor Kimlicka, and I think you went to work with him, didn't you, in Canada? At the time, that was very much a focus of that conference. Well, certainly I recall it as part of that. And discussion of property rights for animals, which was discussed there, because it was about agency, wasn't it, and animal agency. So all those things are being discussed at that conference, which I thought was very interesting at the time. How has that issue of property rights for animals moved on, if it has, from those days? Yeah,
good. So Kimlicka is the author or co-author of a book called Zoopolis in 2011, written by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka, two Canadian philosophers. And this is the book that has really propelled discussions about animals in politics into relative mainstream. It was already fairly mainstream through the work of people like Peter Singer in moral philosophy, but in political philosophy, it was seen as quite a minor issue if it was discussed at all. Now, the property rights angle is something that Donaldson and Kimlicka don't talk about explicitly. They use the language of sovereignty. So these incidentally are potentially examples of what I was talking about finding existing tools in real world or theoretical discussions and trying to extend them to animals. So Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka talk about animals being sovereign over particular territories. The idea of animal property rights, which is something that I've explored in my work, is a different kind of tool to a similar sort of end. In both cases, it's about allowing animals the space they need to flourish. Now, in terms of it moving on, there's been a few papers published in the last few years. One of the biggest things worth mentioning is a book by Karen Bradshaw called Wildlife as Property Owners, which was published in, I think it might have even been this year, 2021. Now, I recently interviewed Karen for the podcast that was mentioned earlier, Knowing Animals. So anyone interested in that book is encouraged to take a look at that. But one of the things that's really interesting about Bradshaw's work in comparison to the work of, for example, me or John Hadley, who wrote a book in 2015 on animal property rights, is that Bradshaw's coming from a legal direction. So she's not necessarily exploring theoretical ideas found in political theory or moral theory or legal theory. Instead, she's exploring existing laws and existing legal practice, specifically in a US context, but it could be expanded to other places. And I think that animal law often runs parallel to animal ethics or animal politics, if you want to use that phrase, but is often doing similar kinds of things, but drawing on different resources. And I think myself, I try to engage with animal law where I can. And I think that philosophers also have a place or a role to play in discussions about law, given questions about the theoretical underpinning of the law, which are kind of the bread and butter of legal philosophy.
One of the things that kind of came to my mind is going through, I must admit, when I kind of like saw some of the titles of your work with sovereignty and property rights, you know, I was kind of sitting there thinking, haven't we got enough problems with this without landing them on animals as well? You know, I mean, but nonetheless, I mean, I think it's an interesting perspective. I mean, you know, there's another aspect which I'll come to later, but one of the things that strikes me here is that it brings to mind the changes which have happened in liberal democracies over the last few hundred years. Adam Smith, of course, famously wrote The Wealth of Nations, but he also wrote a work on moral philosophy, and he saw the wealth of nations. He saw the market system, which he described as operating within a pre-existing moral social framework. More recently, we have had the rise of things like business ethics and business morality, which seem to have become the ethics and morality, or a dominant aspect of ethics and morality in liberal democracies. So it seems to me that actually Smith's perspective has been turned on its head, where we now have economic factors replacing moral philosophy as the ethical and moral force within our society. And what bothers me with respect to the kind of things that you've just outlined is that, given that, what's going to matter is human economic interests rather than the moral philosophical interests, either of human beings or of non-human animals.
Yeah, great. So this reminds, I don't know much about Adam Smith, so I'm not going to comment on Smith, but I think that this is a classic kind of Marxist challenge, right? Or Marxist in flavor challenge that says that, well, it's all well and good talking about what moral principles we have, but morality actually follows modes of production, right? So economic relationships shape our morality. So if we want to change things, we need to change our economic relationships. Now, I'm not a Marxist, and I do think that there is a place for moral reasoning as a route to change. However, I accept that sitting around and moralizing isn't always going to be the most effective way to change the world, right? I think that it has its place, but for example, I don't think that my sitting here and reading and writing is going to be a replacement for actually going out there and engaging in activism. Now, I think it's really interesting what you say about having to change the economic relationships, because one of the things I'm personally quite excited about, and this is a contentious aspect of my own thought, I suppose, my own work, is I'm very excited about what's called cellular agriculture. Now, the most famous example of this is in vitro meat. And the idea is that rather than growing a whole animal so that we can produce milk or produce meat, we just grow the parts that we want. We grow milk in a vat, we grow meat in a vat after starting with a single cell harvested from an animal or a small number of cells harvested from an animal. And this strikes me as an incredibly effective or potentially effective way to change the economic relationships and the economic role that animals play in our society. And I think that a lot of social scientific research in social psychology, for example, has shown that central to the views that we have about animals is the fact that we eat them, right? So in order to gain a much more positive ethical view of animals and to ground much more positive relationships with animals, we need to change the role that animals have in our diets and in our food systems. And it strikes me that cellular agriculture provides a very practical, possible way to change things quite quickly, right? Now, I'm very excited about the rise of veganism. And of course, I encourage people to go vegan when they can. And I think many of the people watching this will be able to go vegan if that is something that they wish to do. However, I also recognize that there are barriers to people doing this, right? Often a motivational barrier. Cellular agriculture, I think in my more optimistic moments, has the power to overcome these motivational barriers. I think for many people, if they can get basically the same product for the same price or cheaper, they're not going to mind whether it was produced via cellular agriculture or via contemporary animal agricultural approaches. In fact, I hope they will say they'd rather have it from cellular agriculture because that doesn't involve the environmental damage and animal harm associated with animal agriculture as currently practiced. And of course, we can now add, we're all aware of the public health consequences, right? We all know what zoonotic diseases can do in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, or dare I say, continuing COVID-19 pandemic. And so we shouldn't be flippant about that aspect either. These diseases emerge because of animals being packed closely together. This particular disease didn't come from factory farming. Others like it did, and the next one might well do. So given these various concerns, animal, environmental, health, I would hope that people would be very motivated to move towards cellular agriculture, even if, for reasons that aren't quite clear to me, they remain undermotivated to move towards vegan diets and plant-based diets.
Given what you just said, I mean, it seems to me that what you're looking for is solutions which work within existing liberal democracies. Chris and I have been around a bit, and we've seen those liberal democracies change quite considerably, particularly in this country, a massive increase in inequality and inequality to access of resources. I mean, are we looking with our moral approach to challenge some of the things that we see as wrong within our society, which actually then lead to problems for animals, which inequality does? Or are we seeking to bend our morals around what already exists in society?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I would certainly say the former. I would hope that it is not the case that, okay, let me put it like this. It can be harder to justify things that are very different from the status quo. It can be very easy to fall into the trap of assuming something is moral just because that's what we're used to, or even assuming something is constant because that's what we're used to, right? And I see this with students, my students who are much younger than me, right? well, not that much younger, but somewhat younger, and they do not
A
necessarily
lot younger than us, Josh.
Quite. But they do not necessarily appreciate just how much things can change, and things can change quite quickly. So let me use a food example as well, because I think this is a really stark example. My grandparents, when they were young, ate whale meat, right? Because this was something that was available during the war period, right? During the Second World War in the UK. By the time I was born, whaling in the UK and most areas of the world had basically been stopped for years. I've never seriously considered whale as food, right? On the flip side, I don't think any of my grandparents before they died will have ever eaten sushi. And indeed, I think many of them would have struggled to recognize it as food at all. And yet, by the time I went to university, all major cities had sushi bars, and now it's a relatively familiar part of the British food landscape, despite having only really arrived in London in a big way in the 80s. You know, so our ideas about what food is can change very quickly. Our ideas about what kinds of foods are ethical can change very quickly. Our ideas about what tastes nice can change very, very quickly. Now, of course, those you might say those are relatively small changes, but you can also have massive social changes as well with regards to public morality and with regards to legal norms. So again, let me use an example which I appreciate is a contentious example, but it's one that often surprises my students. When I went to school, and again, I'm not that much older than my students, when I went to school, it was illegal for my teachers to promote homosexuality. And yet my students don't really remember a time before marriage equality in the United Kingdom. And so they don't necessarily see the advances or changes that there have been in social acceptance with regards to these issues in the United Kingdom. In their head, things have always been as they are now, because they've been like that for the last 5 or 10 years. But of course, the change has been huge, even in the space of 20 years or so.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, my children actually have a very different outlook on sexuality, on identity than I grew up with. They're using terms and approaches which I never even conceived of when I was their age. I mean, it's quite amazing, that change. But let me get back to the point that we're on here. Yeah, you kind of said that I was using a Marxist approach earlier on, and Marx was heavily influenced by Smith. So, you know, I mean, that's perfectly fine. Actually, I don't mind you saying that. But one of the things that Marx, of course, said is that liberal democracies, that capitalism would face consequences because of the contradictions it itself brought up. And one of the things which one could see as being a contradiction of capitalist society, of our current economic system, would be global climate change and the kind of things that is bringing about and actually will do for decades in the future, whatever we do now. Do we need a stronger kind of moral, economic? I mean, can we change our activities towards this? How do I phrase this? I mean, are we just missing the bigger picture here? I mean, should we actually be listening to a Swedish school child and forgetting all these bigger issues of concepts and approaches and moral views? Isn't it really about the future of humanity, the future of sentient creatures themselves is at risk, and we need to do something about that pretty soon?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think you're absolutely right to suggest that maybe we are missing the point when we engage in these arguments about minute things, right, or highly technical arguments. And again, it goes back to that point. I recognize that me sat in my tiny office reading books and writing papers isn't necessarily changing the world, right? It is not enough on its own. Maybe it can contribute, maybe it can help, and I hope that it can, but maybe it isn't helping, maybe it doesn't contribute that much. I'm open to that. Now, one of the things that's really interesting, I think, about the climate crisis is that it points in many of the same directions as the animal advocacy movement, right? So it is not the case that we have to choose one or the other. In fact, I think we have to choose both, right? Let me again talk about food, because that's what I spend a lot of my time thinking about. If we seriously want to avert the climate catastrophe, then yes, we need to talk very seriously about food systems, right? And we need to talk very seriously about moving away from animal use in our food systems, or drastically changing the way we use animals in our food system, at least. The second thing I want to say is that in a perverse kind of way, I think the climate crisis gives me some optimism, and I use the word quite loosely there, when it comes to the future of our relationship with animals. The reason I say that is that I think that we have to change things. Things have to change, right? Our hand is being forced, and our hand is going to be forced much more in years to come. So again, it's quite a dark thought, but I worry that COVID-19 has just been a kind of dress rehearsal for what's going to come with regards to global health threats, but also with regards to global catastrophic climate change. And given these threats, as you say, these existential threats, we have to change things. And I think that that is going to improve things for animals as long as we do it soon enough. And I think we're talking the next few decades. I think we need to see drastic change. And again, I'm hopeful that cellular agriculture might provide a building block of that drastic change. The reason being, it's still going to allow people access to those foods that they crave, those foods that they value, while allowing us to change our relationship to animals and the natural world, and to limit the impact that we have upon both of them, which is something that, of course, we should be motivated to do for moral reasons, for reasons of justice. But I think increasingly,
we seem to have lost Josh for a moment there. I hope he's going to return shortly.
Yeah.
So what's your thinking on all of this, Chris? I mean, how do you view what Josh has been saying?
Well, I mean, one of the things he's been saying, and I think he's mentioned it a couple of times actually, is the role of academics. He's back. He's back.
Josh, welcome back. We missed you there.
We'd fill some time, as they say on the radio, while you came back. Well, carry on. So
yeah, I've had some internet problems. Yeah. So, well, I'll just finish the thought. The thought being that we should be motivated to make these changes for moral reasons, for reasons of justice, and I think that people are slowly waking up to that. But I think increasingly people are going to be forced to make those changes for reasons of self-preservation. And so these moral changes are going to be pushed along by other concerns.
Well, I would tend to agree with you on that. I mean, I'm tempted to say, Josh, well, come and join us. We can try and change the world together. I mean, we don't have to do this separately. And also,
come in there. That's the point I was making, or trying to make, just while we're waiting for Josh to reconnect. I think, Josh, you said at least once, possibly twice, that from your academic seat, if that's the right expression, you can't change things. Well, I think that's you can, and I'm actually convinced that you can't do it alone. Academics can't do it alone. Activists can't do it alone. Dare I say it? Even lawyers can't do it alone. I'm very, very careful. I take on the legal profession. Very wary about those people. But I mean, as a group working together, whether it's the faith groups, like us, whether it's academics, activists, lawyers, animal advocate groups, all working together, then change can come. Which is why I'm particularly pleased that, of course, you're having this conversation with us today, because I believe if we sat in our silos, then no, we couldn't. If we were across those divides, if understandable, work divides, so to speak, then change is going to come, as was once famously said in a 1960s song that probably you don't remember, by a guy called Sam Cooke. So that's one of the things that I find particularly interesting, and this is why, and I often use this statistic, and I'm going to use it now, is that I actually believe, and this, is that change will come with individual change. We have to convince people, especially in animal advocacy, to change their individual behaviour. Whether they eat less animals, or look after their companion animal a bit better, or whether they take care of wild animals, whatever it is, that comes from the individual themselves. And obviously individuals their behaviour is influenced by all sorts of things, of which academics are certainly an important thing, as are activists, as are faith groups. 84% of the world, 84% of the population affiliate in some way, loosely or otherwise, with a faith group. Now, there's no way we're going to change the world's individual behaviour if we don't take notice of that, at least, that 84% of the population of the world affiliate in some way, loosely or otherwise, with the faith groups. So I think, that there is hope by working together across academics, activists, animal activists, individuals, whatever you want to call it. And I'm convinced of that, actually, which is why I said I'm particularly pleased that we're having a conversation like we are today. The way we might not agree all the time about the way forward or the best way forward, working together, and any organisation, any group of individuals have different opinions on any issue you care to mention. Whether it's just a current example, who's going to win Euro 2020? I mean, probably everybody who'll debate that like football, but they might want a different winner. So that's probably a poor example, but it's contemporary at the moment. So that's what I really strongly believe, that across the shared interests of people who do care for the non-human creation, and I also accept that not everybody does care for the non-human creation, but a bunch of those who do, all various people involved in that can work together, however strongly or loosely, for the better of not only non-human creation, but actually for humans as well. CCA doesn't just exist for we don't ignore humans. I mean, humans are part of our remit as well.
Yeah, quite right. And I think it's worth mentioning when we talk about animal rights, humans are animals too, right? And there's a sense in which the idea of animal rights grows out in a big way from human rights. And it would be a mistake to talk about animal rights without also talking about human rights.
Absolutely.
And I think animal advocates and vegans sometimes get a reputation for misanthropy. And I think that is unfortunate. I think there are examples of misanthropy in, the vegan movement and the animal rights movement, but that's something that is a minority and is something that needs to be challenged, because the very principles that justify and support the idea of animal rights justify and support the idea of human rights too.
Can I say, I love the way, Chris, that you went from individual action to a global communal group there so seamlessly. It's kind of I'll pursue that at another time. But anyway, Josh, I mean that kind of like really concludes what I think I wanted to talk about. Is there anything that you want to add which we haven't covered, or that you would like to kind of develop on?
Well, I'd just like to invite anybody who's interested in the kinds of questions we've talked about to not be scared to reach out. I think that it's really important that academic work is translated to the broader community, whether that's the animal activist community or whether that's people who are interested in animal issues without necessarily being involved with activism. So that's something that I try to do through the podcast that you mentioned, Knowing Animals. And that involves interviews with academics doing interesting current work about animals from a whole range of disciplines, right? We've talked about different faith groups, different political groups working together, different academic disciplines should work together as well, and are weaker when they're in their silos. And as you also kindly mentioned, my website, I try to upload versions of all my work, so it's all accessible. Now, of course, sometimes, as with any academic work, I'm engaged in a particular conversation, I'm engaged in a particular issue, but I'd like to hope that a lot of my work speaks to the sorts of issues that animal activists or people interested in animals might want to address. And often, as I've suggested throughout, it is about taking ideas that we might already have a notion of. So we've talked about property, I've recently worked on ideas of hate speech, and extending those to animals and seeing where animals might fit in those conversations.
That's terrific, Josh. Thank you very much for your time and for, I mean, a really enjoyable conversation, and one which certainly I think Chris and I have appreciated. So thank you for that. That's it for this edition of Catholic Concern for Animals YouTube channel. There will be links to Josh's website and to Knowing Animals at the end credits of this, so if you want to go along, then please do and have a look at what Josh is saying, even though we wildly disagree with it. You know, it's important to have these people around. Thanks, as I said, to Josh for another great conversation, and we'll see you all again in the near future, I hope, and thank you for watching. Thank you.